Welcome to the All Things Endurance podcast. I'm your host, Rick Prince, and today my guest is Chris Soden. He is the founder of Strategic Fitting, which is a bike fitting company based here in Littleton, Colorado. I was actually in his shop, a couple weeks ago, I guess.
Yeah.
I'm excited to have him on the podcast. So, Chris, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, always excited to talk about bike fit, and I know a lot of athletes, a lot of people have questions about it, and it's always great to take a little deep dive into it.
Yeah, we're definitely going to be talking about everything bike fit today. Chris has 30 years experience in the industry in multiple roles as a shop owner, mechanic, as well as an expert fitter. So, which is what we're going to be talking about today. So, Chris, maybe if you, aside from that little intro, if you might be able to give any of our listeners a little bit more about your background, how you got into fitting, and kind of how that trajectory has gone.
Yeah, I'm probably, my story is interesting because I played a ton of sports growing up. I was very athletic. And up through college I was chasing a baseball scholarship, and my arm finally went, and I'm a big guy. I'm like 6'5", 240 pounds. Depends when you catch me, but I'm a bit different, and I got into cycling and very quickly realized that whether it was the mechanical side of working on the bike or just the fitting, like not a lot of people at that time, and again, that was a ways ago, but not a lot of people kind of knew what to do with me. And it would be like, oh, we can't get the bike to make that sound. And so I kind of had to figure it out on my own if I was going to stay immersed in this. And as I started working in bike shops and started kind of working as a mechanic, I was always intrigued at the relationship between the body and the bike. And I just think the bicycle is one of the most beautiful things that's ever been created. It's so efficient. It's just gorgeous to look at. It's amazing what it does. It's amazing how somebody can pop off the couch and probably ride 5 miles, yet they maybe would struggle to run a mile or run a half mile. So there's a lot there to it. So I started working in shops, and slowly but surely, as my career progressed from running shops to kind of wanting to continue to ascend, I think my passion was always in higher end custom road bikes, and that's what got me excited. Time trial bikes, kind of the peak of that. And at the time, there just weren't. It's a little different than now, where kind of everybody has access to the same stuff. Back then, you really had to go to certain shops to get
Yeah.
that sort of exposure or that sort of product or even knowledge. So my career path kind of followed along. I started working at the shop up in Boulder called Pro Peloton, and they focused basically on high-end custom road and triathlon bikes. And if I was going to work there, then I had to go to fit school. And that put me on a path with Serrata at the time. Ben Serrata had a fitting program out of upstate New York, and so I went to that, and it just was like one of those moments. I got to work with some of the best people at the time in the industry, some people that ultimately became people that I looked up to, mentors, people that were really pushing the envelope of high end bikes and fitting, and just became kind of completely immersed. And to be fair, I was lucky in that in coming back to Boulder, I was in a community that was very focused on fitting. So I was in a way lucky in that there were so many people, and bike fit was on so many people's kind of minds and coaches, and that I was doing quickly 10 to 15 bike fits a week.
Wow.
And you can't kind of help but learn in that experience. A lot of what maybe I thought was quickly dismissed, and it's always been a mantra of mine to kind of keep learning. And at the time it was very, there wasn't a lot of tech, and so you were training your eye, you were learning how to speak to clients, you were kind of understanding what was happening on the bike and the product selection. And it was a time when bikes were very different. Bikes were 23, 25 millimeter tires pumped to 120 psi,
Yep.
and very aggressive front ends, and you're trying to take a good solid average athlete who has a job and try to put them on a bike that a Tour de France rider would ride. So yeah, just kind of loved it, stayed with it. I mean, I joke with people, it hasn't really felt like work, and I feel very, very lucky in that regard. I've continued as I've gone through my career, to either kind of have the ability to work in those spaces, whether it's running a shop, owning a shop, bike fit studio work, now kind of appointment based, and kind of doing my own thing.
Yeah, I love that. It's so interesting how you were, you chased sort of the high-end bikes and the high-end fit and all that. Growing up in high school and college, I worked summers in a bike shop in Pennsylvania, and it was the polar opposite. It was
Yeah,
like we had one bike I recall that was over $1,000. Everything else, the average bike
yeah,
was 400 or 500 bucks. And back to the fitting, it was one of those things because no one cared about that stuff, right? It's just I need a
yeah,
bike to scoot around. So it was always stand over the top tube, lift the bike up. If you
yeah,
can get a couple inches between you and your crotch or the wheels off the ground, that's the right fit. Good, done, out. So
yeah,
it's so interesting how if that's obviously the most basic level and obviously the stuff we're going to talk about on this sort of how high it goes. I mean, it's really a wide spectrum. Obviously, one is much better fit than the other, clearly.
yeah,
But it's interesting what when people say, "Oh, I'm going to get a bike fit," or "I need my bike to fit well," how that can be just such a wide range of perspective,
yeah.
really.
Yeah, I often say we often use the same words but use them very, very differently.
Yeah.
And being fit on a bike can encompass everything from, a quick 5 minute look from somebody on a trainer to being outside a shop and just riding kind of a loop and having people look at you. It's funny you mentioned that about kind of the standover height. There on all bikes at that time, there used to be a thing that was basically proper. It said proper bike fit, and it showed a person standing over a bike with a certain amount of clearance. And I used to cut that out, and I would have that in my fitting area because to me it was always kind of that reminder of those words can mean so many different
Yeah.
things. And to be fair, like I do everything from like in-person fitting. I've done a bunch of online consulting with clients, and at the end of the day, right, everybody who's in that space is trying to achieve the same thing, which is just
Mhm.
give their client a great outcome and make cycling more enjoyable. I'm very much a proponent of, high tide raises all boats.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely the right approach for sure. So I
Yeah.
guess on that note, this is obviously a very broad topic as we just sort of mentioned as far as bike fit. But if you had to kind of go back from sort of, the 1,000 mile view, what does a good bike fit process look like? As far as all your years of it, are there some things that really stick out as far as these are just some staples of what a good bike fit process looks like?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think it's as I would define it. I think first and foremost, you have to realize that everybody you're working with is going to be different. They have different goals, they have different aspirations. They have, somebody comes in, hey, I just want to be comfortable. Another person comes in and says, oh, I want a podium at Steam on Gravel, and everywhere in between those. And your job is really to try and listen to the client, give good counsel. I think proper bike fit really happens in a space where you are, to me, you're you're assessing the client, what's going on. So many times, like I'm getting somebody who's on fire, something's wrong, a knee hurts,
Mm,
saddle pressure. Um, but so you're trying to address maybe a specific issue. First and foremost, you're documenting where the bike is in space, where you're really trying to document, and technology certainly helps with that. But you're trying to document where did this bike come in? Where is it positionally? How has the athlete been engaged in that? What is the injury history? A little bit of pre-fit assessment, some basic kind of stretching, some watching your athlete move. Because to be fair, bike fit is not going to solve something that maybe you struggle with off the bike.
mhm.
If you're a runner and you've had a chronic knee issue, it's probably going to showcase itself on the bike, but there are product selections and things you can do within that bike fit to kind of minimize those. So I think for me, a proper bike fit really starts at the beginning, understanding where your athlete is. What are they trying to do? What does success look like for that person? To me, then it's you're working within that space. In my case, I'm using probably some of the best technology in the world right now, which I'm super excited about to help me see and help the athlete see the changes that go about during a bike fit. I think most people would be somewhat shocked and surprised at how probably little or small the adjustments are and how large the impact is coming out
Mm,
the other side. And it's a funny sport because I tell people this all the time. It's one of the rare sports that it's a sport of efficiency. And I talked about earlier, the bike is so amazing that it does so many things well that it can mask what is perfect and what isn't. If you and I go to a golf range and we start hitting golf balls, like I can probably tell pretty quick that hey, this is a good player, or gosh, this person probably needs a lesson, or the clubs are wrong because there's this visible like, is the ball in the air? Does it go far? what does the swing look like? But we could go for ride for a bike, and if nobody knows anything about bike fit, it's, it can be somewhat innocuous.
Sure.
And so I think it's in that space. What I'm trying to do is make adjustments based on data, based on the feedback of the athlete, to put my athlete in a better position to succeed, to create better form, and then document where that comes out. A little bit of my justification would be if you came in right after a bike fit and you said, "Hey, you just worked with Tina, and walk me through what you did." It would basically be, okay, here was Tina, here's where her bike was positioned, here were the measurements, here's the initial video capture of what we saw in the position, here are the adjustments that I made based on these numbers and based on her feedback, and here's where we ended. It would very much read as kind of a, tell me what you did and why you did it.
Hmm.
I think sometimes where bike fit is can be a struggle, or it can be tough for people to grasp, is if there isn't some sort of measurement or capture of that document. So much of what I hear is, boy, I wasn't sure, it felt like my saddle could come up a little bit, so I raised it up a bit, and I went on a ride and it felt too much, so I dropped it a tad, and then I bumped it forward a little bit, and then I dropped the nose a little. Well, like all of those things, I've worked with customers where dropping it a tad could be 2 inches.
Oh, interesting.
And right, because the just that it's not their space. They don't
Yeah.
they don't appreciate that.
Yeah. A
And
tad is
some,
subjective.
a tad is subjective. And I think I want my athletes working more in, I lowered my saddle 5 mil because I gave them a window to operate within. But then I asked them, can you give me 6 to 10 rides and really not pull that wrench out, and make sure that you give it an honest assessment, because your body needs time to adapt.
Hmm.
And now we have the dynamic where everybody is different. Those adaptive, some athletes are what we would call high absorbers. Like they're just going to take that change and they're going to run with it and they're going to do great. Other athletes, it's like you sneeze on their bikes. What'd you do? Oh my God, it feels so different. And
Yeah.
and again, like kind of everywhere in between. So part of it, being a good bike fitter, I think, is a little bit managing those spaces, managing those athletes, managing expectations. And it's why I think we work so well with so many coaches, because coaches kind of have that same relationship with their athlete, and they're looking
Hmm.
for that athlete to have the best outcome, and they're much more immersed in kind of what's happening. um, so we document the position at the end and let the athlete absorb those changes. I think for me, something that I've wanted to, in a way, kind of redefine for my own career is, it's really important to me that bike fits don't feel like this kind of one and done, very expensive anniversary dinner. We're only going to do it once every 5 years. Because the reality is, like, you don't maybe get a chiro adjustment once every 6 years. Your
Hmm.
bodies change. Even within the season, as things happen. So I'm trying to make it more kind of approachable, more relationship based. I want clients to kind of reach back out. There's implied follow-ups in all of my services, but it's not like something that you have to come in. If we change the position and everything feels great, like I probably don't need to see you again. But if
Hmm.
you're struggling with that adaptation, or you're questioning something, or you want to try something further within that range that we talked about, well then, hey, grab that slot and come back in. And I don't just want to hear when everything is, rainbows and everything's amazing. I want to hear when somebody's struggling with something. And so for me, that's just a little bit more of like how I want to structure. And certainly, there's an element of cost, right? Like sometimes I've had clients say that, like, well, can't you, I wish it was less. And I'm like, well, but I don't want to do less of a job, and I don't want to use
Right.
less technology. And I think in my experience, what I found is anytime I tried to do less, I got less out of it. The athlete got less out of it. And even though the athlete maybe initially said, hey, I'm not that serious, I'm not like my friend who's, I just need a quick look. It's only going to take you 15 minutes. That's the person who probably struggles the most and needs
Yeah.
the most help.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I mean, I do think pretty much with everything, right? But I think especially when it comes to really almost, clinical precision type things, whether it be surgery or bike fitting, like you get what you pay for,
Yep.
And again, you go to the bike shop like I worked at, and bike fit's free because I just pull the bike up to your crotch, and then there's,
Right.
what you
Right.
charge and the all the tech and equipment and 30 years of experience. So yeah, I think that, it is what it is, you get
Yeah.
what you pay for.
Yeah, and I think I've always tried to maintain that I don't want to be. probably purposely everything to everybody.
Sure.
I wanna kind of reside in athletes that are looking for something specific like that, maybe equate it to a higher end restaurant. Like we know
Yeah.
what we are, this is what we're trying to do well. And I'm not the place to get a grilled cheese sandwich. And I'm okay with that. And
Yeah.
I'm happy to say to that athlete, hey, that's not what I do, but here's three or four other people who are great in that space. And you can certainly engage that and a lot of times have a good outcome.
Yeah, I mean, you never go into French Laundry, right, out there in Napa and expect, a the same price you get a Burger King, and you certainly wouldn't
Yeah,
even broach that. But it's funny how,
yeah,
while you wouldn't do that in that context of like, to your point, fine dining, I worked as a personal trainer for years. You hear that all the time. Be like, I have a degree in kinesiology. I've been doing this for 20 years. Yet no, I'm not going to drop my rate to $40 an hour. That's not going to happen. So it's funny how different
yeah.
industries are like that, where
I
people feel
know.
comfortable saying, hey, could you drop your price? Or hey, that's too expensive. I've always found that just that whole dynamic fascinating.
I'm the same, and I always use the analogy. It's like we all at some point in our lives have gone and spent $10 on popcorn at a movie.
Yeah,
Like, right? Like of all the things that aren't really don't add up, like we kind of know what popcorn costs. We kind of know that, but it's also like, hey, I'm at the movie, I want popcorn. Like that's part of the deal.
that's part of
And
the
I think,
deal.
yeah, and I think in services for me, it's funny. One of the teams that I sponsor is the CU Tri team, which has been like super
Oh,
fun, great kids, and just
cool.
kind of at that fun arc of their career where they're trying to be students, they're on their own kind of for the first time, they don't have
Yeah,
unlimited budget. And when they approached me about sponsorship, I thought long and hard about it. And of course, the first thing they asked is like, "Hey, can you do something different about the cost because it's so high?" And I basically decided that like I'm not going to change my protocol. I'm not going to change the equipment. Part of my sponsorship is going to be doing the same thing I would do at the rate I would normally do it, but just augmenting it for them. And
yeah, I love that.
yeah, and I think it proved itself to me as just a reminder that you have to charge for your services. And if you decide whether it's a friend that you want to take care of or a great client or whatever it is, like you shouldn't ever stop doing a good job and use all the tools at your disposal.
Yeah.
And that's been a really fun because I get asked a lot, and I've had moments in my career where I've done it, and it's just been a good reminder.
Yeah, that's great. No, that's definitely good information. Um, So, having 30 years of experience behind you, there's certainly, just like coaching, there's an art of coaching. There's obviously the art of fitting. And, I'm sure I could come into your shop, take all your tools out and all your diagnostic stuff, and you'd still do an amazing job. But
Yeah.
how do you sort of mesh the art of fitting with the technology now that you have there? And maybe if you could even discuss some of what that technology is and kind of how you blend it all together to your point and to your verbiage, have the best outcome for your clients, for your athletes.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. My career I've run the gamut, right? I started having to train my eye, and I was using literally a plumb bob and a
Mm,
goniometer and a
yeah.
Sonata size cycle, and you're physically taking all the measurements. And in a way, I'm happy that I had that because I think it burnished my chops a little bit. And to be fair, being kind of coming from the mechanic side, I had a really comfortable competency of working on bikes, moving shifters, unwrapping handlebars. It sometimes I forget as I've been in situations where I'm training, say, somebody who's interested in fitting, how much those things are a big deal. Like
Yeah.
grabbing somebody's $10,000 bike and trying to smoothly put it on a trainer where you have to pull the rear wheel off, and like that can be incredibly intimidating for people.
Sure.
So for me, having started without really any motion capture, I think that was in a way kind of a cool thing and a cool way to start. I think as I progressed, obviously there were things like Dartfish and ultimately Retool kind of became
Yeah.
the standard of motion capture. And Retool was basically a harness-based system that had lights, 8 lights on each side of the rider and a bar, and you would spin the rider and you would capture data. And the idea was to turn that rider into a stick figure and be able to kind of analyze the numbers that you saw. And it was obviously a market improvement. You could travel with it. It kind of opened up a ton of different opportunities. What I'm using now is probably like the ultimate expression of that. Kind of, I was telling somebody the other day, it's like Uber was kind of like, or taxis were kind of like the retool.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
and Velogic Fit is kind of like Uber. It's definitely poised to change the game because what it does is instead of just having a harness and a beam that's collecting lights and turning an athlete into the stick figure, you get those same angular relationships, but you have the entire athlete in the picture. And you're
Ah,
taking a left right side capture in a time synced manner. So I'm taking a 30-second capture of the rider in position, and then going back, I can look at the capture. I can pull up one of, 40 different metrics and analyze how are they sitting on the saddle? What's their knee position? And I can look at left, right time, real time.
hmm,
Then, as I make changes to the position, because the rider is static in space centered between these two cameras, I can overlay those. And so the athlete can see the difference. So I had an athlete I was working with yesterday, and it was very classic, kind of bought a really nice high-end bike on sale. What really started hitting the throttle and riding a lot. And as he started riding a lot, he was starting to get some back pain and some upper shoulders. And sure enough, like his saddle was just too high, right? He bought a bike that was maybe a touch on the big side, not a deal killer, but it was one of those like classic accommodations where the bike's a little big, the stem's pointed up, maximum spacers, and he's a really good athlete. And he's just riding kind of a not ideal position because he had
hmm,
overcooked his saddle height. His saddle setback was off, and the reach to the bars was a struggle. So it's a great example of like his main complaint was like the bars felt too far. And
hmm.
ironically, that had nothing to do with the bars. The bars were actually perfectly placed. It had to do with where the saddle was. So the
Gotcha.
saddle position created too much reach. And I think that's where it's just a continual reminder to me of how tricky these things can be, because it is a bit of a moving target and people tend
Yeah,
to focus on one thing. It's kind of like the creak in the bike. Oh, it's my bottom bracket. No, it's actually your headset.
yeah,
It transmits and sounds like it's in the bottom bracket because it's rhythmic, but a good mechanic can kind of show you how it can do that.
yeah.
So Velogic Fit is kind of that next expression. And now there's even a third camera. So I can look at aerodynamic profiles. I can look at
Hmm,
CDA values. And look, it's not a wind tunnel. It's not promising to be, but it's something that is you can draw comparisons to, and it's something that you can trial, and it's something that you can see a physical change as you make changes. And I think all of those things are to the betterment of the athletes that you're working with. And what I love about this new system that I've really been working with the last 6, 7 months is the athlete gets to see the change. Because
hmm.
before, I could mail somebody their measurements and I could say, look, here was your saddle height. It was at 750, and now it's at 735. And the person's like, okay, like, well, yeah, it feels
Yeah, what does
different.
that mean?
Right. And now it's here was your initial position. You can see the posture and you can see the change in posture. And even somebody who doesn't know really much about bike fit can say, oh, that looks better to me, or
Yeah,
that looks more athletic. Or, it's funny sometimes how really good bike fit kind of more often than not just looks good. You
yeah,
can kind of, and I say this with bike position, like oftentimes when a client first comes in, and a saddle's jammed all the way back or handlebars rotated all the way up, like the chances of that being correct is probably slim and none. I'm not going to
yeah.
say never because it can happen, but there is this funny thing of like good bike fit visually looks pleasing and
Hmm,
and balanced, and I think in a funny way that taps into what I noticed well before I even got into the bike fitting side, when I was just working at a regular bike shop, not really that different from what you were working at. And you're just trying to like get a baseline of somebody. Does somebody look balanced? Do they look relaxed? Do they look like they can reach at all the key points?
sure.
So yeah, it's a good example of like the tech that I'm using now. And you combine that with also like state of the art saddle pressure mapping, and suddenly you can just piece together these kind of things like, oh, this right hip is further forward. Well, look at the saddle pressure mapper, they're not sitting on the saddle correctly, so of course there's a left saddle sore. And I think before we would understand that these things were happening, but maybe couldn't dive into exactly why.
Hmm, got it. You mentioned something I found so interesting about, like what you were saying about like, there's this noise and hey, it's coming from the bottom bracket, but it's not, or hey, it's the handlebars, but it's actually the seat. Are you familiar with Dirk Friel?
Of course, yeah.
So he was a guest on our podcast the other day, and we were talking about the role of technology in coaching, and specifically in regard to AI. And he said something that I thought was really fascinating. He's like, AI, when you ask GPT, is the only thing that's going to spit out, right or wrong, is going to be the answer to your question. But if you ask the wrong question, then you're going to get out some bad output. And his example was, let's say someone went out on some say SBT gravel, for example, and went out, tried to go out with the leaders and blew up after 10 miles. They're like, oh my God, I'm sure it was my sodium. I got to Google, how much more sodium did I know? It's the
Right.
issue that you just went out too hard. And obviously a coach would know that. And I think it's very interesting because it's the same analogy to the fitting. Like, hey, this is it's my saddle. Like, no, it's your bars, or vice versa. So I
Yeah.
think it's, again, the role of an experienced coach, the role of experienced fitter is to know the right questions to ask,
Yeah.
right? And to get the right outputs.
Yeah. And it is like one of the things I always tell people is like really proper bike fitting probably in most cases doesn't align with what bike shops are trying to do.
Mm,
Because in a way what I'm saying is like, hey, you could benefit from a more realistic crank arm length. I'm not going to say shorter crank better because that's kind of what the industry does. It says, oh, shorter,
sure.
it becomes the hot thing and then everybody just kind of funnels down that path.
Right.
um but I may say, hey, given your injury history, given what your symptoms are, given where your stretching is, or how flexible you are, like you'd benefit from basically riding maybe a little bit shorter crank arm. Well, the minute you do that in a shop environment, the shop managers are like, Chris, what am I going to do with this old crank arm? And now I gotta go buy something to get this bike out the door. And I 100% understand that, and I've always kind of maintained, and maybe been a little bit at times brash about it, but like, if you want to sell high-end road bikes, that's part of the deal. Like,
Hmm.
you don't just get to sell a $13,000 bike, pull it out of a box, put the handlebars on, inflate the tires and say, here you go. Like, there's obviously more margin, there's more money to be had, and in those bikes. And to me, there just is a level of like, if you really want to give somebody the best experience, and I understand that not everybody has the time to put into it like that, but when you're selling somebody a brand new bike and the crank arms are brand new and like you're able to replace them, like isn't that kind of value add? Like doesn't that just push that client out into the sea of cycling in a better state? And I think, what Dirk kind of mentioned was spot on. Like so many times, I kind of joke, it's the muscle between the ears is sometimes the
Hmm.
hardest one to train for most
Yeah,
athletes because
agreed.
they come in with this momentum and they know like, oh, it's this, it's that. And I think like if we think back on the history of fitting, so many times there were like shims and wedges and cants and it was kind of under the guise of like, oh, I'm going to magically put this wedge in and suddenly this knee is going to do all these amazing things. And to be fair, really good motion capture kind of proved that that doesn't always happen.
Hmm.
I wouldn't say never, and I think there's a place for that stuff, but I went through that phase where I remember finishing a fit and somebody's like, what, you're not going to put any wedges in my shoe? Because that was considered like kind of part of it, and it was this physical tangible thing that at least somebody could see, like, oh, I got a bike fit, see the wedges in there. But did you
Yeah,
really analyze, like, did you have the technology to capture what the knee was actually doing, or was your rider kind of
right,
posing? If you're trying to make your left knee go straight, like you can do that, but is what at what cost? Like the right
right.
hip is now diving in and your right back is extended, and like sometimes it's we have those things that we focus on as like, oh, that's the answer. And to your point, like you just went out too hard.
Yeah, yeah. I think I remember that period. I think it was Paul Swift, right, who came out with
Yeah,
the big
yeah.
meat wedges. That was like everybody was throwing wedges in, and it was just that was just
Yeah,
what you do.
yeah, and look, I always try to be very, very like respectful and
Sure,
and those people have like they've fit tons of people and they've had great outcomes.
sure.
But I just think that like part of the reason that you can have a great outcome is that you don't really see a significant change in most cases. Like
Yep.
really good motion capture doesn't show you that the knee angle really changes. And yeah, you could put like a laser line and that probably is somewhat open to interpretation. And when the athlete thinks like, oh, that's what I want to do, you can kind of make that thing happen. And it's one of the things as a bike fitter, it's a bit like a lawyer, like you can't lead the witness.
Yeah.
Oh, that saddle height feels better, doesn't it? Right? Like it's how does that
Yeah.
change feel? Because your athlete may say that change feels horrible, and you
Yeah.
have to honor that. And if you say that that saddle height looks great, how does it feel? they might be less inclined they may just default to, oh, I don't know. So I'm going to
Interesting.
defer to the expert.
Interesting. Yeah, that would make sense. I could see that certainly occurring. So again, in your 30 years, as a shop owner, and now obviously as a specific fitter, what are some of the biggest mistakes that you see? I mean, you've alluded to some of these, but what are some of the biggest
Yeah.
mistakes you see, people like myself making where I just start like, oh, feels weird. I'm going to do this to my bike. Are there any like
Yeah.
standard ones that you typically see mistakes?
Yeah, I think there's probably it depends a little bit on the community, right? I mean, we have, the triathlon community who is like continually absorbing and reading and seeing what the top elite pros do. You have the mountain bike community, you have the road racing community. I think probably, there's probably a small disconnect between what they want the bike to look like, kind of the slam that stem kind of
Oh,
mantra,
okay.
right? Like I want my
Yep.
bike to look cool, and it's like, well, me as a fitter, I want you to look cool on the bike. And I want to bring the bike to the athlete. And the reality is every athlete has a position that they can replicate. Some are better at doing it than others.
Yeah.
I think some of the common mistakes, there's probably too much time spent in this bike is too big or too small. There's a funny, and it cracks me up. There's a funny Facebook thread, and it's basically it's people posting their time trial or triathlon positions and having people comment on it.
I've seen that one. They get thousands of comments. It's
Thousands.
crazy.
And inevitably half the comments are your bike is too small or your bike is too big.
Yeah.
And it makes me laugh because it really is kind of not really understanding how bikes
Yeah.
change. Um, the reality is probably most people, if we eliminated what we ideally want as kind of a great looking bike and a very proportional fit, there's probably three sizes of every bike that somebody could ride. So you could
Mm.
take a really small bike with a max spacers and a leveraged up stem and a seat post craned up in the air, and you could probably make it work. There's the bike in the middle, which is probably the one and very proportional, and it enables the athlete to kind of make changes to that bike over time. And there's probably the one that's too big. We're going to have less seat post showing. We're going to not have as many spacers. We're going to have a very short stem. That is very just broad brush, but I say it to kind of prove that the athlete in space in all three of those bikes is in the same position,
Yeah.
right? It's not like buying a bike too big forces a position that is incorrect in most cases.
Yeah. Good point.
Now it depends, right? If we have a company like Giant that maybe only has 4 or 5 sizes in a particular bike, that analogy may not work. But in most cases, so like I think that gets overserved a bit. I think to be fair, the one piece of advice that I would give people is, and it kind of dovetails into that, your contact points, you only touch the bike in three areas: your hands, your sit bones or your undercarriage, and your feet. And all three of those areas have some of the least amount of blood flow in the human body.
Mm.
And those three things have to support your body weight and create and allow you to hold posture in a way where you can push one leg at a time into a drivetrain. It's in a one way, it's very simple, but in another way, it's like it's actually pretty complex, and
Yeah.
it's fraught with, so as a bike fitter, I don't change frame sizes. I don't shorten top tubes. I don't cut seat posts. I change the positional relationship of contact points in space, and in some cases recommend different equipment that will better allow that athlete to have one of those contact points in a better spot. Definitely cyclists can get enamored with the latest, greatest thing right now, right? It would be super, super narrow handlebars, shifters rotated super in. And sometimes like we kind of forget that like, hey, it has to be ergonomic. You have to be able to brake. You have to be able to shift correctly. It's not just about being aero, but it's about being kind of safe and connected to the bike. So, those are the common things I see. I would say too that like people generally don't have a great perception of as saddles wear out, as cleats, as pedals wear,
Mm.
especially high performing Colorado type riders, right? Where and I would imagine mechanics would chime in too, like, oh yeah, this every time I see this bike, the drivetrains completely work. And the athlete's like, what are you talking about? Like, I just, I'm not even racing. I'm just riding. And it's
Yeah,
like,
it's
yeah,
fine.
but you're doing 250 miles a week and you're riding, you're climbing half of that and you're not great about chain maintenance. So I think erosion is something that's very difficult for athletes to see. And as fitters, Like I had a guy yesterday, the same guy yesterday. I, had him pop his shoe off, and I popped the shoe, just pushed the cleat into the pedal, and he had XTR pedals, right? Top of the line pedals. He had bought them himself. He had put the cleats on himself. They weren't in an ideal position, but they weren't off by a ton. But he had forgotten the tiny little spacer that goes between the bottom of the shoe and the cleat. And that
Hmm.
changed the orientation of where the cleat sits relative to the pieces of the mountain bike shoe that ultimately should support the pedal. And
Hmm.
because of that, he had very, very little float or very crunchy float. You lube the spring, you put the tiny spacer in, you put the cleats in a slightly different position and even them up. It's two distinct, very different things.
Hmm.
And because it's his bike, because he rides it every day, like he he struggled to perceive that, and that can be the challenge. There is no check engine light on the body or on the bike, and I think with cars, right, the brilliance of it is like, hey, we're monitoring all these things. This is out of bounds. Boom, check engine light. You should get it checked. We don't really
Yeah.
have that on the body. We just have pain. Or
Right.
we have discomfort, or we have this feeling, or we have this, oh, after 3 hours, it does this. So I think those are generally the things that I see. It's simple things like people tend to they may buy the cheapest pedal. Like they may come in with the $9,000 bike and they have the $50 Shimano pedal
Okay.
that's designed for like not the $9,000 bike. It's designed for the person to see if they're going to enjoy riding. It has a bushing in it. It's not even a good quality bearing. And when you give that pedal to that bike and that athlete, high mileage, high power, lots of events, dirty terrain, like within a year, that pedal's blown up and it's
Sure.
toggling. And now all of a sudden I have a knee niggle, or I have a hip issue, or I have a
Hmm.
low back. So I think a lot of it is kind of self-induced.
Yeah.
And to be fair, also, bike shops can sometimes struggle in those spaces to tell the difference to the client. Like
Right.
if you said to a client, well, this $50 Shimano pedal is really designed for somebody getting into the sport. This XT pedal that's $120, it has a better quality, bearing. It has a much more lighter body, a much better spring. This is really meant for people who use it. It's not a huge difference in cost. But if you just kind of say like, oh, they're the same, this one's 50, that one's 120, there aren't many people that are going to buy the more expensive one.
Sure. Sure. That's a good point. That is a very good point. So, as technology from the bike perspective has improved, or not even improved, but changed is maybe the better word. Um, I want to know how that has influenced the fit process. Like one of the bikes behind me, I'm in the process of trying to build up time period correct. It's a 1988 Pinarello Montello. I'm trying to get like the Delta
Oh, yeah.
brakes and C record and all that. That's
Yeah.
my pet project right now. But again, I
Cool.
can manipulate everything on that, right? I can change this cable. I can do this. And now there's, one piece bars and stems. There's, all sorts of things. How has that changed over the years as far as let's say I just bought a $10,000 bike or $15,000 bike and it's got the one piece bar and stem, it's all aero, and I come in to see you, I'm a complete disaster on this. And now you obviously can't take a hacksaw out and cut that down the middle and change those
Yeah.
out. So what do you do as a fitter in those situations?
Yeah, it's to be fair, it's becoming more and more common. I think the
Hmm.
first thing that I would suggest is the reality of these bikes, the specialized tarmacs, the factors, the Pinarellos, the bikes that come with these integrated options. Really, you need to do some sort of pre-fit, or you have to really have a good
Hmm.
understanding of where those coordinates are in space, and you have to even knowing where you think, and it kind of, in a funny way, it's beyond like, oh, I always run an 11 stem, or I always run a 42 center bar, because even those things are changing, right? Now a 42 centimeter bar probably means that it narrows at the shifters by 3 to 4 centimeters, and it
Hmm.
might even flare at the bottom. So an NVAR bar in a 42, it narrows to a 39 or a 40 at the shifter and flares
Hmm.
to a 47 at the bottom.
Oh, wow.
So
Okay.
so if you say to somebody like, "Oh, I'm a 42 centimeter bar," okay, but your two basic parameters have changed about where your hands are going to be, and that's fine as long as you understand it. So I think pre-fit, um, and I'm doing a ton of that. Like I'm doing a lot of new bike fitting to be able to tell the client, okay, if you go purchase this bike, we need a neutral seat post, we need this amount of spacers, we need
Hmm.
this length stem, because the manufacturers usually offer all of those in most cases, particularly companies like Bentham or Factor, not so much maybe specialized, but at least again, my client is armed with the information that, hey,
Sure.
this 56 centimeter comes with this setup. I need something different. I'm about to give you $13,000. Can you work with me?
Yeah,
And if they can't, then it gives them more information about their buying decision, about where to buy it, or that initial relationship. Or like, okay, now I know that I'm gonna have to buy this $13,000 bike, and I'm gonna have to buy an additional $800 handlebar,
sure.
because like mechanics will tell you, like, I got one shot to build this bike. I'm going to
Yeah,
build this bike to this position. And so the position, we can't just move spacers. We can't just exchange a stem. We can't do all of the things that we used to do. Now, I would say all that to say that handlebars have probably never been as good as they are right now.
hmm.
Like, one thing about your project that you're working on, if you look at the where the shifter sits on the handlebar, it will be vastly lower because of the era of those handlebars where they really have a drop and then they move into the shifter. So that's a great example of, you could take two bikes, you could take the top of your saddle to the top of the handlebar, and you would go, oh, that's exactly the same on both bikes, my period bike and my brand new bike.
Yeah,
But it'll feel completely different because
yeah,
your hand on that older bike drops an additional inch to an inch and a half
yeah,
because of where the shifter position is.
yeah.
So I think those are, those are the challenges. That said, like, I'm incredibly bullish about where bikes are today, because we've never had better gearing, we've never had better tires, we've never had more comfort. As tire sizes have gotten bigger, bikes have had to naturally get slightly higher in the front end and more balanced. The slackened head angles that also needs means that the bikes are a touch shorter. So your average customer today is probably way better positioned to buy a bike in terms of all the things that you would check in terms of gearing, tires, ride quality, all of those things. It's never been as good a time to buy, but you probably have to be a little bit more focused on the crank arms, the handlebar widths. I mean, there's a reason why kind of women specific bikes have disappeared, because
Hmm.
women specific bike geometry and better geometry just merged to the point where it was silly for
Oh,
manufacturers to have two different of the same spec.
interesting. I was wondering, that's I didn't have that on my sort of list of questions, but I was wondering that. I used to
Yeah.
see that all the time, and now, yeah, you kind of don't see that anymore. It's largely been
Yeah.
phased out, the women's specific thing.
Yeah, and it in the one hand, it's a great example of the industry really trying to say, hey, we haven't done a great job of like building bikes for, a possible 50% of the population who would be
Yeah.
riding. On the other hand, they kind of missed the boat, because in a way, what WSD bikes, women specific designs, it was all the different monikers that companies use, but basically women specific bikes were based on the premise that, oh, well, women are longer in the legs and shorter in the torso. So we're going to make a really steep seat angle, usually a degree or two steeper than most everything else that was out there. And we're going to make a really short top tube. But it wasn't really a short top tube. It was just short because the seat angle got steeper. And that's kind of the
Right.
relationship that happens. So you basically, women are longer in the leg, so the seat post sticks out a ton. The bike is short, which is great, but then you have all of this drop because the front end of the bike hasn't kept with it.
Hmm.
So it was just a great example of like, and I remember situations where like a woman who's 5'11", like they didn't make that size. So
Right.
so what am I supposed to tell this woman? Like, oh, you're a woman, but they don't make that size, so you can't get a women's specific bike. And
Right.
really, at the end of the day, like the important takeaways are maybe a more proportional handlebar, maybe levers that have adjustment reach for size of hands, like maybe differences in saddles. But to be fair, like even that's kind of like less of a thing than it used to be. Good saddles are good saddles, and
Yeah.
they fit pelvises either really, really well or not as well.
Hmm.
So yeah, those are, I've been around long enough to have gone through those, and I and
Yeah.
I, and I think like it is, people, peers of mine that have done the same thing as me, we all laugh. It's like we just keep running, like, oh, when are elliptical chain rings going to come back? Because if you hang around long enough, it's like there will be somebody in 2 years that goes, you know what we should do?
Yeah.
Elliptical chain rings.
Yeah, that's right. My wife was just telling me that she had some yoga pants she bought years ago that went out of style and now they're back in style and now everyone wants to buy them. It's like a very
100%.
cyclical kind of thing, I
Yeah,
guess.
100%. Yeah, somebody kind of goes nudge nudge, hey, we haven't looked at this in a while.
Yeah.
And lo and behold, it comes back.
Yeah. So if I'm not in Littleton, Colorado or San Francisco and I want to find a great fitter who's not you, what are some things I look for? Are there any, like, obviously with a personal trainer or a coach, I could certainly give really good recommendations as far as these
Yeah.
are the five sort of things to look for. What about a fitter? What are some things? Because again, I think because the word fitter is so general, everything from,
Yeah.
again, me pulling the bike up to the crotch to you and everything in between. What are some things that if I wanted a really quality bike fit, I should be looking for?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, you don't need technology, but I think technology is always a positive. Because technology serves, I like to describe to people like really, really good bike fit in kind of maybe a perfect scenario should be the amalgamation of three things. And it doesn't always have to be equal parts, but it's usually better served if it's closer to that. And that's equal parts, fitters experience, riders feedback, and the technology.
Hmm.
The technology serves as a, so imagine a scenario like where I'm saying to you like, hey man, I think you're riding, I think your saddle height's a touch high. And you're like, man, I've always ridden it here. Like I'm not having any problems. I think it's fine. Well, I might lean into the data to show you that from an angular perspective, your knee extension angle is at the high side. I could show you that your foot is starting to compensate because of the saddle height that you're running. And it's not meant to override it, but at least I have something else instead of, well, Chris thinks I'm too high and I think I'm fine. That to me is where most fitters or most experiences can get in trouble because
Hmm.
if you don't have kind of a relationship between those three things, even if the technology is just taking really good measurements and documenting them, that can be enough because at least then when you see a client back, you can measure something and go, okay, we had a saddle height of this and now it's this, and the client's complaining that this is now happening. When you don't do that, when it's just kind of the very informal hop up in the trainer, yeah, that looks pretty good. I don't know, then it's one, I think it encourages the athlete to tinker with the position, which, as we talked about earlier, can be a little dangerous and
Hmm.
and open up kind of some windows where now you're trying to hit a moving target. And two, you either end up having a scenario where like the fitter's personality and belief system about where bike fit should be kind of overrides that.
Hmm.
And I've seen that, like, and I've always just been very cautious myself to not be, like there's fitters who are like, I think everybody should ride a higher saddle height because it protects the knee. Well, no, like really we see as much knee pain because saddles are too high as we do because they're too low. Like some of these misperceptions that like, oh, if the front of your knee hurts, your saddle's too low. If the back of your knee hurts, the saddle's too high. As always, there are some times where those things can be true, but it's also it's there's plenty of times when it's not. And the minute we start saying things like that, then you might catch some people in that net, but you're also going to lose a lot of people.
Yeah.
I think what people should be doing is obviously if there's some semblance of tech, I think ultimately you're looking for somebody who is accredited if possible. Um, Ideally, like I think if you have a fit studio or somebody who's doing solely fitting, and I would say the same thing about a mechanic. Like if a mechanic has got on their own and they're opening their own thing and all they do is work on bikes, chances are like that person is really, really good at that. They have a
Yeah.
clientele base. They're really, really good rather than kind of the person who finds themselves in the bike shop where like they go from fitting a kid's helmet to like changing a tube to adjusting a derailleur. Like you kind of end up doing a little bit of everything.
Yeah.
Not that that's a bad thing or you can't have a good outcome, but I think what I'm seeing from my 30,000 foot view of the bike industry is a bit of an explosion of the traditional bike shop. And I think like
Hmm.
Colorado's a very kind of a big example of that, where you have more than ever standalone bike fit studios. You have standalone mechanic studios. The bike shop that has everything is gone, or at
Yeah.
least it's not doing those things at the level that the client base who's left is expecting
Hmm.
because the chances are that you're going to walk into a big shop and you're going to have an excellent fit experience and an excellent mechanic experience and an excellent customer service. You might have two of the three. You might have one of the three. And so more and more, the athletes that are left, I think, build their own team. No different than, hey, I got a coach and I have this PT that I work with, and
Yeah.
I go to this person for dry needling, and I have a mechanic that I go see from this, and I have my bike fitter that that's kind of what is happening. It's less
Hmm.
about going to one shop,
Interesting.
particularly at the level that I would say that I engage people,
Yeah.
which is kind of more, people who are really getting after it, really riding, want to enjoy the sport. Not, and again, not that you have to race, like, but if you're riding 5 times a week and you're not in an optimal position, like it's just a matter of time for your body kind of goes like, oh, I've had enough of this.
Yeah.
So, and then to me, like I think you want to ideally find somebody who's interested in the journey that you're on, and that it isn't just a one shot kind of.
Yeah.
And look, like $400 or $500 or $600 may be too expensive for you to feel comfortable spending, but it probably also can't be 100,
Right.
right? Like somebody has to take the time to be able to walk you through it. Ideally, if there's a follow up, ideally, if you get some sort of a list of measurements, that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to basically say, here's a good example of where my position needs to be. One of the things that I say to my clients all the time is a client may come to me and say something like, well, I always ride 54 centimeter, right? I'm always a 54. What I want them to leave is saying, here's a saddle height range that works really well for me. Here's a crank arm length that I do exceptionally well with. Here's a reasonable amount of drop that I can handle.
Hmm.
That is a much different customer that's walking into a bike shop, even if it's not mine or the one that I'm associated with.
Yeah.
That's a much different experience, and that's a much more educated athlete. And I don't think that there's any way that that goes sideways, because if you think about it this way, like that 54 centimeter has changed so much the last 5 to 6 years
Hmm.
as tire sizes have gotten bigger, as fork spans have gotten longer, as standover heights have diminished, that maybe you were right on the fringe of riding a 54. Maybe when it was a flat top tube and it was a 23C bike, you could do it. But now that it's a sloping bike and now that they're trying to squeeze 38C tires into that bike, maybe you're not a 54 anymore. But if you
Hmm.
knew your saddle height and you knew some of those things, um, then it makes it a little different.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. The other thing I really loved what you said, and this is something that we really focus on at UESCA, is, we really focus here on science and evidence-based information. We try to take as much bias out of the equation as possible as far as education is concerned. And we do see that a lot with coaches. They're like, look, you got to do these three workouts if you want to be faster. You have to do this, this, this for, or, to your point, you got to have the, high seat tube or high seat post or
Yeah,
low seat post. So
yeah,
it's so I guess refreshing is maybe a good word to hear or right word to say, like, look, I look at the data, this is what it says. This is what it's not what I personally feel, based on
yeah,
my 30 years experience of just I have this inherent bias, but this is what the data is telling me. So hey, let's give
yeah,
this a shot and see what happens.
yeah. And I think that's where the lack of data can be so challenging, because now you have this space where you really have maybe a more combative, and I've heard this, I've heard people who have come in from fitting, like, oh, I went and saw so and so, and okay, do you have any data? Nope. No, all I know is just it didn't feel great. And in a way, like that's a bummer for that fitter, because
Yeah.
chances are that what's being told to me wasn't that bad, or the client may have tinkered with the position and
Hmm.
lost the position. So I'm always very, very sensitive to, like, look, I wasn't there. For all I know, you were saying like, hey, higher feels better, and you jacked that saddle up to the point where maybe the fitter just threw their arms up and said, gosh, okay, if that's where you really want it. So I think, in my opinion, like, I think all fitters, just like all people in bike shops, they want to do a great job. It's a
Yeah.
bit probably a function of, if it were me, I'd be asking, like, how many fits a week do you do? What's your
Yeah.
education background? What's your, are you allowed to kind of operate freely within this space within the bike shop? Because sometimes
Hmm.
it's like, a fitter at a let's say a Trek or a Specialized shop, like they're only going to have certain products that they can sell. They're only going to have certain
Sure.
saddles. And is that better than nothing? Yes, but like if you sit on a Specialized assometer, it's designed to sell you a Specialized saddle, and I don't
Sure.
I don't begrudge that. They make some of the best saddles in the world, but sometimes it's nice to be able to try a Cell Italia or try an Ergon or try an SMP, and just see for yourself, as well as if you have a really good high quality pressure mapper, like kind of see under the hood. Hey, you're
Yeah.
sitting a little bit more square on this. You're sitting a little bit more to one side. Um, it's been one of the funny things for me, maybe and it's a great example of, I think, me just wanting to continue to learn. I used when I was at my previous place, we used a saddle pressure mapper, and it was basically an iPad. It was an Italian company. It wasn't inexpensive, but it wasn't like state of the art. And I think very quickly it was like, gosh, I'm not sure this really like drives decisions. Like, okay, so we
Mm,
see these like, whoa, 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 whoa. You see these like kind of pressure points, but what is it really driving? I mean, I can't really say to my client, like, look, this pressure map looks great. And the client says, this sounds terrible. Like, I can't ride this. And
right.
I'm gonna like override that because the data is really good. And it soured me a bit on saddle pressure mappers. And it was a great reminder because I don't ever want to be like not continuing to learn. And
Sure.
in exploring this new tech, I was kind of forced to like, hey, the person I was working with was like, I really think you should revisit saddle pressure mapping. Like, I think you didn't work with a great one. And of course, like it was like 5 times more expensive. And
Yeah.
I was like, of course. But I would tell you like very quickly, in a way, it doesn't drive decisions, but it gives you more clarity on what's going on.
Yeah.
So I may do a saddle pressure mapper on one of the hottest saddles that's out right now, and the athlete really isn't sitting on it well. But from a saddle pressure mapper standpoint, but if they love it and they're riding well on it, that's going to be their saddle.
Yeah.
But at least I have the data at some point to say, if they come back and say, gosh, man, I'm really struggling with this. I had a guy a couple weeks ago, was convinced he had a leg length discrepancy because he sits on the saddle. Over time, he has changed his pelvic relationship and changed what neutral is to him and his
Hmm.
proprioceptive reaction. And so that creates in his mind a feeling that one leg is perfect and one leg is off. And so many athletes with cycling have that. And we have this perfectly symmetrical thing. All of our favorite mechanics meticulously show you how the shifters are dead on perfect and the stem is perfectly straight and the seat, sits perfectly straight. And then unfortunately the rider gets on it and they're a twisted hot mess because of
Yeah.
imbalance and maybe not doing great off the bike work. And
Yeah.
it's being able to show somebody that is so much more powerful. And to me,
Sure.
like it's where it points back to you and your coaches and the team that you're working with, because I know it's not as sexy, but sometimes the answer is, hey man, you got to go home and do band stretches. You
Yeah.
got to do hip openers. And you can't just do them on one side that you feel like is giving the problem. Like part of your job as an athlete, as you're doing 10,000 miles a year, you are not pulling yourself into neutrality. You're pulling yourself away from it. And if
Yeah.
I start coming in putting wedges and cants and shims and adaptations, it's just going to encourage that.
Yeah.
And you're really going to get twisted. And I think that's an interesting point where the wedges and shims and all that stuff has gone is really off the bike work.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
I would say if I was to reassess
Interesting.
kind of where I am now, I'm probably way more bullish about insoles, proprioceptive create like proprioceptive reactions that can happen from just a good quality insole.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about like correcting anything. That's a podiatrist. But just when you make the foot feel better supported, you get better knee tracking, you get better kind of
Sure.
recovery phase. And yes, a little bit comfort because your arch is better supported. And everybody out there, especially in Colorado right now, is buying a $450 shoe and it has a $2 insole in it.
Yeah.
And it's a great shoe, but it's so stiff and so light that it really can put the foot under a lot of strain if you don't kind of manage that relationship internally. And it can be like anything from even a specialized over-the-counter one. It can be a
Yeah.
Retul footbed. It can be anything that's kind of moldable or designed for a little bit more cycling specific.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that, for me personally, I know that was the biggest benefit. I've always, as soon as I get the new shoe or the new bike shoe, I always toss that and get the insoles just to support that arch. And,
Yeah.
you know, I think it's huge. Um, so you kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier, both in terms of you were saying like if kind of having that team around you as well as what you were just saying with band work and all that kind of stuff. How do some of these other ancillary sort of I'm going to call them sort of just professionals. How do they integrate with you? Like, do you have a team? Like, let's say if I come in and I'm a hot mess, because I'm probably sure a lot of these things you just mentioned probably apply to me. Um,
Yeah.
and you say, oh God, look, this is what's going on. You need to go see this physical therapist or you need to go see this biomechanist. Do you often refer out to people, to other professionals, if you think that, a client could really use that service?
Yeah, it's a good question. I probably walk that path of wanting them to see somebody, but being less specific about who they see.
Got it.
Just because I tend to see people from so many different parts of Colorado that
Sure.
like say an orthotic or like a corrective orthotic, like I know that it's important that they probably get that done locally because they may
Yeah.
have to go back to that person 3, 4 times.
Good
And if I
point.
say, gosh, you're in Colorado Springs and I'm going to refer you to somebody in Niwot, Colorado, like, if something's not right, are you going to drive back up 2, 3 times to get that fixed? So I
Right.
probably, I think I'm lucky in that most people in Colorado have already started to explore those channels. I have a couple people who I have a ton of experience working with. One of my favorite things are just maybe some coaches or people that can add some strength training and some kind of body motion and movement. We have to remember that like all you do all day long on a bike is just do this with your legs up and down with torso stability. It's not really something that you're going to do anywhere else. And
Right.
so lateral stability, glute med work, band stretches, I think a lot of it is I try to leave it up to the athlete. I may just say like, hey, it would be really important to see a PT. If they ask me for somebody, I have a couple people that I work with that I enjoy and are great and I know do a good job, but I kind of feel like sometime, and I'm probably just a little bit more guarded because I don't want people to feel like oh, it's always that right answer. It's, everybody's different. Like the
Sure.
people that people decide to work with, like they're going to choose for a whole host of reasons. It's going to
Sure.
be convenient cost. Um, I think at the upper end of athletes, people who are really getting after it, I might be more specific about, hey, I'd love for you to see this person because they deal with exactly who you are.
Hmm.
And mostly it's PT. I think it can now even be like we went through the whole phase of like, oh, everybody just should be more flexible, right?
Yeah.
Like I always remember this story, but I had a guy come in. It was when I was in San Francisco, and he came in with a specialized roubaix. Now, the specialized roubaix is already like one of the best fitting in terms of like if you wanted a not aggressive, super comfortable, well balanced, short, high top tube, you know, like if you wanted that, that is the ultimate expression. When you look at stack and reach charts, the Roubaix traditionally is like 15 to 20 mil higher in stack than almost any bike in the market.
Hmm.
And this guy came in with a Roubaix, and they literally had like everything was jacked. He had a 17 up degree stem. And I was kind of like, walk me through what happened. And he's like, oh, the guy at the bike shop, he had me do a hamstring stretch, and I had tight hamstrings. So all of these things got done. And I was like, oh, well, that's right. Like that's just crazy.
Yeah.
And in a way I understand it, and in a way that's kind of what I see, and it's can be what happens with these oh, you have tight hamstrings so you need this. There was no assessment, there was no like even concern about putting the bike in that position of like, hey, what happens when you take this down a hill at 45, 50 miles an hour,
Right.
which to be fair is something that bike fitters probably need to get slightly better at. Like
Yeah.
part of your job is to make sure that your athlete can ride the bike comfortably, that the position is sustainable. um, I probably see that more when people might try to do bike fitting from like a PT background or maybe not as much of a bike background. And
Hmm.
they know the body incredibly well. And they've decided because in their local area, nobody's really doing bike fits that they start doing some of that. Um, but I think it's just, to me, it just was a great example of like somebody saw one thing and made this complete overcorrection.
Yeah.
And sure enough, like we're in an interesting age right now where I would argue that more bike fits that I'm doing are taking people that are in too conservative of a position and
Hmm.
putting him, and they're struggling with that because as they're trying to ride more and ride better, they're so unathletic and the bike is so leveraged to get it to some crazy point that they just can't perform well. No
Yeah. I
different
could
than
see
if,
that.
yeah, like no different than if I took that athlete to the top of a ski hill and I said, all right, ski down this hill, but you're not allowed to bend and rotate and be athletic. Like you just
Right.
need to stand straight up. So, you do this long enough and you kind of see this progression. It's like I started my career and you're trying to find ways to get, older, more realistic athletes on race bikes and the struggle that that entails. And now it's come full circle. Now it's like
Mm,
bike shops aren't doing a ton of fit work. And so, it makes sense, right? Like, hey, we're selling this person a $9,000 bike. We're not doing any bike fit. They've told us they just want to be comfortable. So I'm going to keep that saddle low and I'm going to jack that front end up and they're going to be comfortable because I
yeah,
want them to have a great time on the bike.
yeah,
And and they love the bike. They love the experience until they start training for something and riding more often. And it's like, oh, my shoulders hurt. And gosh, I'm getting more knee pain. Well, yeah, because you're not using your glutes. You're not even rotated into a position where you can utilize your glutes.
yeah,
And sure enough, like people can handle pretty good positions. And as the equipment's gotten better, that's one of the fun things about it. It was never fun to put like gigantic upright stems on old kind of racer bikes because that
right,
person that person is pot committed to that bike and they can't buy a new one. It's much better to kind of put people in better positions and see that like, wow, this is amazing.
yeah,
Like not only am I more comfortable in a better position, but I'm actually riding better and I'm
yeah.
finishing races quicker. And
That's
like,
amazing.
yeah, it's kind of one of my pet peeves of what the industry tends to do. It's like, oh, do you want to be aggressive or do you want to be comfortable? And I purposely try to not use those words
Yeah, interesting.
because like who doesn't want to be comfortable?
Right,
But like, I mean, but there is like even somebody in an F1 car is comfortable.
right.
It's like it has to fit them, but it's
Yeah,
so performance oriented that you can't jack them out of the car and sacrifice the aerodynamics.
yeah,
But like, but I think if you like aggressive isn't bad and comfortable isn't always good. And
yeah.
I try to like athletic is important.
Yeah, well, that's so interesting you said that. I never thought of that. But when you phrase it in that way, do you want athletic or do you want comfortable? It's the understanding is that athletic is not comfortable, and then comfort is not athletic, right? And
Not
it's
or
like the
not
two can
fast, yeah.
coexist, right? And you can have that quote unquote, probably perfect position or close to it. But
Yeah,
that's interesting. I never thought of it in that term because you do hear that a lot. Like, okay, if you want the aggressive position or you want to be comfort, and immediately you think of like Tadej Pogacar and you think of the person on the e-bike going to pick up their groceries, right? And
right.
nothing in between, right?
Right. I'll give you and I can't take credit for this because it was somebody that I worked with and he's a great dude and so I'm 100% I steal it from him all the time. But your typical athlete who's doing it, let's say um they sign up for a triathlon. And maybe it's a half, maybe it's a full, something pretty daunting. And you'll get that kind of like, Chris, just put me in a position so I can finish.
Okay.
The underlying assumption being don't make me too aggressive. And I've seen that. I've seen athletes come in where, the arm pads are higher than literally the seat,
Oh,
right? Where
okay.
it's just kind of that same assumption that like, oh, you just want to be comfortable. Well, boy, we'll make you comfortable. Here's where the TV remote goes.
Yeah.
And one of the
That's my
things
kind of
that
bike, by the way.
exactly one of the things that he said, and it always stuck with me, is how about we put you in a position that enables you to finish better and ride faster
Ah,
because that's actually going to move the needle and give you a better chance to succeed
yeah,
because if you're in such a poor position and such an unaerodynamic position and you're not even taking advantage of what the bike is supposed to do,
yeah,
you're going to be out there an extra hour and a half, which means you have an extra hour and a half to think about quitting, to mess up your hydration, to mess
yep,
up your food intake, to take one more bathroom break, to have your stomach kind of fall apart through nutrition.
sure.
And kind of like doing something at that pace is like not really fun. Like you can
Right.
do it, but like it's way more encouraging to like, man, I'm riding really well. I'm riding at a decent pace. Yes, I'm not gonna, somebody's not gonna knock on the door and say, hey, can you join our team? But like you're just doing it at your best version of yourself. And I think that always stuck with me that athletes can probably ride a little better position than they think. And in their head, they think like, oh, I can't do that. Like
Yeah.
it's a great example of like try. I'll give you a little for me. What's a little nugget? People look at triathlon bikes in TT position and they inherently think because of the way that it looks, oh, I can't ride that position.
Sure.
And
Sure.
it's a fundamental misunderstanding of what's happening with the bikes. What you're doing is you're rotating the athlete in space. The angular relationship in a TT or a tri bike is basically identical to a road bike.
Yeah.
You're just changing the dynamics of the bike by changing the functional places that the athlete sits. And the minute you rotate the athlete, you have to make room for the upper arm. And so
Yep.
there has to be drop.
Yep.
And if you take an athlete and rotate them in space and then put them in a comfortable position, there's nowhere to go.
Yep.
And
Yep.
it's such a great example of people perceive it like, oh, I can't make that.
Yeah.
I can't be that aggressive. It's like you're not. And
Yeah.
again, that's where motion capture. Look at your hip angle. Look at your forearm angle. How does that feel? Oh, well, I could actually weight into the front of the bike now. That actually feels pretty good. I feel like I could be here all day.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
And oh, by the way, you're a little bit faster and you're taking advantage of some of the aerodynamics. So I think
Yeah.
that's a maybe a good example of like things that I see. And as much as I do it, and as much as many times I've had those conversations, all you need is one bike ride outside to kind of see that like, oh, there's still work to be done, which is great. It
Yeah.
it, it keeps me busy.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I'm sure I'm 100% positive I will be booking a session with you. I mean, I remember part of our content and our certifications, I forget the exact percentage going back to the leg length discrepancy, but it's like very small single digits of people that actually have a structural leg length discrepancy of a
Yeah.
meaningful structural leg length, and everything
Yeah.
else is functional, right? Like how I sit, how
100%.
I drive
Yeah.
my car, all of
Yeah.
these things. And I'm sure I'm in that boat.
And people inevitably will tell you, like, oh, I went to my PT and I have a leg length discrepancy. And I always say it, like, is it functional or like, have you gone to a hospital and had it x-rayed? That's really how you have to do it.
Yeah.
Like, you have to go to
Yeah.
a hospital, they block your hips, they x-ray your legs, and then you compare the x-rays. And
Yeah.
there are, again, I don't want to under or diminish it, but I would say, especially for me, a lot of my career being in Boulder, like I used to laugh at like 90% of the people walking around feel like they have an LLD, and
Right.
and it is mostly functional, and it is mostly how somebody sits on this. I mean, so many people just don't sit on the saddle, and it's kind of squarely.
Yeah.
And it might be because they don't want to have to buy a saddle. Saddles have gotten to three, four, $500. All of these things I appreciate that, it's like, oh, it's not that bad. I'm dealing with it.
Yeah.
And
Oh,
or
yeah.
just or even like, look, I'm gonna go buy a saddle. I'm gonna spend 200 or 300 bucks and it might be worse.
Yeah.
There's real tangible like reasons that people kind of stay where they are because they can, I'm just going to grin and bear it. And you have other people saying like, oh yeah, that's cycling. Yeah, yeah, I get numb every ride. Like that, I've heard that.
That's just
It's
supposed to
literally
happen.
right. I joke, right? It's like literally you're watching Darwinism at work. You're just like, it's not how it's supposed to happen. But
Yeah.
sometimes the the commitment to an athlete and say, look, it might take 2 or 3 visits of you coming in and us plowing through some saddles to make sure. But I would say that it's worth the fight because once you find something that's more suitable, and it's not going to be like the magic unicorn. I think sometimes we do a disservice by, kind of setting an expectation. It's still a bike saddle. It still
Yeah.
has to hold the majority of your weight in an area that is very sensitive and
Yeah.
doesn't have a ton of blood flow. So it's a bike saddle. It's not a couch. So we have to set reasonable expectations, but can you sit on it well? Does it promote good posture? Can you do it multiple days in a row without any sort of saddle sores or numbness? That's not an egregious checklist to try to like strive for. And I think ultimately, bike saddle is so much of your bike fit that if you aren't really addressing that, you're probably just wasting a little bit of time with everything else.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that completely makes sense. Um, Last question, and this is more out of just morbid curiosity, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah.
How often do you see people who, um, okay, I just bought this $15,000 bicycle and now like it should because of the amount of money I spent, everything should be perfect. Like it should fit like a glove. And when
Yeah.
they probably, wrangle with it forever and by the time they finally come to see you, now they're just super pissed that, oh my God, now I got to spend another $400 or $500 on a saddle when I just spent $15,000 on this bike, or I got to pay this guy Chris to do this when I mean, why do
Yeah.
I need anything else? I just bought this crazy expensive bike I could have bought a Ducati for. Do you see that a lot where people are just like, why doesn't this work? I just spent all this money.
Yeah, it's funny. Like I think I've probably seen it. I wouldn't say I see it a lot. I
Hmm.
probably see a little bit more of the opposite. Like I might be more
Oh.
apt to see the person who's not in a great position, but because they spent 15 grand, they're not willing to like even go there.
Oh, okay.
So like it's one of my funny, like I'm seeing this with saddles, and I won't necessarily call out the company, but a couple companies are doing it. But there's a lot of like very high-end 3D printed saddles that are coming out. And when you read what a 3D printed saddle should be, it kind of sounds great. Like, oh, it does this. Oh, it does this. It relieves pressure. Oh, it molds to me. Oh, and so, there's a lot of people that I'm seeing now who come in with those saddles and they bought them because the expectation is they're the best,
Hmm.
and they don't love it, but they're not willing to admit it because they spent $400 on a saddle.
Okay.
So,
Got
uh,
it.
yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and I think there's a lot of people. I would say that like there's nothing really different about a $15,000 bike than a $9,000 bike or a
Hmm.
$5,000 bike in terms of touch points, because
Sure.
if you get the pedal right, if you get the saddle correct, I think too, it's like a $15,000 bike, you still have to put the time in. You still have to work on your body. You have to understand what good posture is. You have to learn to kind of engage your core. You have to, I mean, it's not going to ride itself. There are bikes that you can purchase and do that. And even, I mean, even to be fair, and it's a little bit of a segue, but like, I think even if you think about the perception of e-bikes in the marketplace, like you still have to ride an e-bike. Like
Sure.
I'm one of those funny people. Like I'm actually very pro e-bike. Like it gets people out there. The data supports
Yeah.
that people are riding them more than they were their traditional bike.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing.
Yeah.
And it's missing the boat if you just assume that somebody's getting on it, hitting the throttle and not moving. That's not how
Yeah.
those bikes work.
Yeah. And I
And
just want to be lazy and not do any work.
yeah, like
Right.
it's there's a funny current and perception out there about e-bikes that is in a way kind of like a little it's a bit of a bummer,
Yeah.
because I just look at it as like, hey, if this is getting you out there and you can continue to ride with your friends who are, in Colorado, like there's tons of groups who are really still getting after it. But if you're just realistic and like I just can't go out for 5 hours anymore and ride at 19 miles an hour, um, and I need this to continue to ride with my friends, like I think that's really, really cool. Like
Yeah.
there's probably the other side, like, but you also can't drop your friends on the hill by hitting the throttle. Like
Right.
that's not
Right.
cool. That's
Right.
not a cool thing to do.
Yeah.
So yeah, I appreciate the question. I wouldn't say I personally have run into that a ton. I think it also, to be fair, it depends. I know from personal experience, it depends a little bit on the process. I know for me, in a perfect world, if I'm doing a new bike fit on a size cycle of some sort where the athlete can feel the position, they can feel the equipment changes, they can feel the crank arm lengths, we have a good idea of a saddle that they're going to use. That is such a different outcome
Mm.
when you deliver that bike, because you've taken all this effort and all this time to basically say, hey, here's what looks good, here's what works good. Even if it's a stock bike, but you've chosen the neutral seat post, you've chosen an appropriate stem length, you've chosen a good amount of spacers, you're confident in where all the angular relationship is. That, if there was one story that I could tell, it would be that. Because when you just go buy a $15,000 bike, a Pinarello from a website, and it's delivered, you still have to go through that next experience of like finding a way to make it work. And bikes like that might have 25-30 mil offset seat post and it looks cool, but in your size bike or a smaller bike, like that's a huge change. Like that might
Yeah.
be double the amount of saddle setback that you need.
Yeah.
And those are great examples of like where it can kind of go sideways. But I
Yeah.
think I know from my own experience, when people go through that process of understanding, a new bike fit, hey, here's where your position works really well. Now you go to the marketplace and you say, all right, what bikes achieve that? What
Yeah.
bikes achieve that in the best way? And then you build it to that, you build it for that athlete. That's pretty crazy cool. And the feedback that you get from those athletes of like, oh, I never knew
Yeah.
this was possible.
Yeah. And you know what's
Um,
fast? You know what's so fascinating when you say it in that way? It's like, again, if I'm buying a $300 bike to putter around town, I'm clearly not going to do that. But if I'm going to spend 9, 10, $15,000 on a bike, to know that that bike is going to fit like a glove or as close to fitting like a glove, based on doing the pre-fit. Like it's almost like and again, it sounds weird, but it's almost like a no-brainer. Like that's what
Yeah.
people kind of should do because then you're not quote unquote wasting money or have to do all these other things because you've already done it, and now you know
Yeah.
what to look for and to expect.
Yeah, I think it's, there's so many fun human dynamics that are tied up in that. I agree. I mean, for me, I've done it so much in my career. I had a bike shop that was totally based on that. It was like fit first.
Hmm.
Like, you're not buying a bike unless we go through that process. And if you don't want to go through that process, hey, there's 18 other places in town that you can go. And it wasn't done to be a jerk. It was just done to like, look, we have a standard and we have a methodology of going through it. Appreciate it might not resonate with everybody, but you get kind of the like, oh, I know. Like I know I'm a 56. I know I'm this. I had somebody tell me once, and it was really funny. And it kind of happens a lot. Somebody might tell me something like, I'm really meticulous about my saddle height. Like I can tell if it's a millimeter off. Oh, really? Okay. What saddle height do you run? It's 724. And we measure it and it's 715. And it's like, okay, so that narrative of like I'm meticulous, that narrative of like I know, it's okay. Like I'm totally fine with it, but it does kind of remind me that even people that perceive that can be off. It's one of the funny stories I always tell. Like I get this a lot, and I'll get this when I travel or I do events or um, inevitably somebody will come up to me and say something like, "Oh, you have to look at my buddy Bob. Like he just looks awful on a bike. Like he really needs a bike fit." I'm like, okay, well that person at some point I might see them on their bike. And to be fair, it's not much prettier.
Right.
Like, but and it totally makes sense, and it's such a fun human kind of story of I get it. Like you're looking at Bob and you're seeing what I'm seeing,
Yeah.
but you have perceived yourself as being kind of in a more athletic, better position.
Yeah.
When that person,
Fascinating.
yeah, when that person kind of sees themselves, I mean, it's the running joke. Like, what makes me the busiest? Race photos.
Right.
Hey, Chris, I just got my race photo. Like, I see people because they get their race photos. I see people because they're injured or there's a nagging injury. I see people because somebody saw them and said, "Oh my God, you look terrible. You need to go." The reality is, what I'd rather do is I'd rather see people because they understand that bike fit is important and that it's pretty rare that I see somebody where I'm not going to make a ton of changes.
Yeah.
And even then, most people left to their own device are probably going to miss the mark. And they'll
Hmm.
generally, I would see it's sometimes funny to me to think about how many times people either just overcorrect too high a saddle height, overcorrect too low a saddle height.
Hmm.
And they're usually trying to solve something else, and that is driving their decision making. And
Yeah.
they're kind of not addressing the main issue. Um, and in overshooting it, they kind of create the scenario where now there's inherent compensation, and that compensation is really the issue.
Yeah.
And one side is usually a little easier at handling it, and the other side isn't, and the body
Yeah.
just kind of slowly drifts to try to make its peace with that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes sense. By the way, before we finish off here, there's literally a Facebook page specific to running called Ugly Race Photos, and it's always like, it's
Great.
hysterical. It's
It's
great.
probably like our time trial positions. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, Chris, thank you so much. This was such great information. I know I certainly got a lot out of it. I'm going to need to be booking a session with you ASAP because I'm sure I
Yeah.
have, of the things you mentioned, probably three-quarters of those issues are
Yeah.
mine.
Yeah.
For any of our listeners that want to learn more about Chris and his fitting, you can go to strategicfitting.com. If any of our listeners are looking for a discount on any of our USCA certifications, you can use code ATE75 for $75 off. So, Chris, thank you again so much for your time. This is great. And yeah, I will be seeing you soon.
Look forward to it. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank, thank you.